So first I want to introduce our first speaker for the roundtable, and that is Rebecca Laberenne. And she said I could pronounce it any way I want, but hopefully I got it right. She's the Associate Director, Service Implementation for 100 Resilient Cities program. Rebecca is a licensed professional engineer with a background in structural and earthquake engineering. She has over 13 years of experience in the design and construction of buildings and bridges, as well as in project management and strategic consulting for building and infrastructure projects. That's quite a bit. Rebecca joins the 100 Resilient Cities from Guy Nordinson and Associates, a structural engineering consulting firm in New York City, where she was an associate partner with the lead engineer responsible for the structural design of the new National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and numerous other domestic and international building and pedestrian bridge projects. She has also worked with the NGO Build Change on post-earthquake housing reconstruction in both China and Haiti following the 2008 and 2010 earthquakes, and is actively involved in confined masonry design and code development. Rebecca holds a Bachelor of Science in Engineering degree in Civil and Environmental Engineering and a Certificate in Architecture from Princeton University, a Master of Science degree in Structural Engineering, Mechanics, and Materials from University of California, so she went to the West Coast, and then completed her Master's of Public Administration at New York University, and she went back east. She is on the Board of Trustees of Geohazards International and the U.S. Board of International Association of Bridge and Structural Engineering. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Laberenne. See, you said I could say anything, right?
So thank you very much. I first want to thank the International Code Council for inviting 100 Resilient Cities to participate in today's event. As an introduction to this global roundtable, I'm going to give you an overview of the 100 Resilient Cities program and also talk about our definition of urban resilience. And then I'm going to go through 2 case studies of climate-related initiatives in 2 cities in our global network, Da Nang, Vietnam, and Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So our program was established in 2013 as part of the Rockefeller Foundation's centennial anniversary. It's a $167 million initiative to build resilience in 100 cities around the world. Through these cities, we're seeking to build a global practice of resilience, one that didn't exist before. And we want to change the way that cities think and the way that they plan. The ultimate goal is to use these cities as a test bed to understand how we can influence resilience in over 10,000 cities. We hope that in 10 years, every city will have a chief resilience officer, just as most cities now have chiefs of police. The program focuses on cities because the majority of the world's population currently lives in cities, and it's projected that by 2070, more than 70% of the population will be in 2050, more than 70% of the population will be in cities. So we have a huge opportunity to impact cities. When we talk about resilience, it's a little bit different from, I think, the way it's commonly defined, particularly by building professionals when they talk about resiliency. We define urban resilience as the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a city to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. So I think there are 2 things to note about that definition. One is the fact that resilience isn't just about addressing the periodic physical shocks that a city faces. It's also about looking at the chronic day-to-day stresses that a city might face, which could be economic or social. The second point about this definition is that it's not just about recovering from one of these events. It's about using it to learn, to adapt, and to thrive. So a city is actually better off having experienced the shock or stress, and it becomes sort of a transformational event for the city. So Judith Rodin, the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, refers to this as bouncing forward as opposed to bouncing back. So this is a diagram of what bouncing forward looks like. You can see that the shock occurs, and then a resilient city is one that actually improves its path of development as a result of that event. So what are some of the acute shocks and chronic stresses that cities face? So acute shocks are the one-time events like earthquakes and sandstorms and infrastructure failures. These are the hazards that are traditionally incorporated into building codes and standards. And chronic stresses, on the other hand, are ones that weaken the social fabric of a city over time. Some examples are high unemployment, crime, and chronic food and water shortages. Some of the effects of climate change could also be characterized as chronic stresses like nuisance flooding and slowly increasing temperatures, the types of sort of slow onset effects that climate change cause. When looking at individual systems, it's helpful to identify the qualities of those systems that enhance their resilience. And so this slide identifies the 7 qualities that describe the behavior of resilient systems that enable them to withstand, respond, and adapt more easily to these types of shocks and stresses. Some of these qualities, like robustness and redundancy, are familiar to building professionals as they're integrated into the building design processes already. Others, like reflection and inclusion, might be less familiar, and I think it's interesting to consider how these additional qualities could be incorporated into existing regulatory processes to increase the resilience of the built environment. So let's quickly look at one real-world example of how this definition of urban resilience can be applied. In the early 1990s, Toyota built a manufacturing plant in northwest Turkey, which was about 3.5 miles from a major fault line. The plant was built with this in mind, and this photo shows the plant following a 7.5 magnitude earthquake that occurred in 1999. And so as you can see from this photo, the plant is in perfect condition. The roads and the bridges look perfect, but there's something odd about this photo. As you can see, there are no cars on the road, and the reason for that is because the city was completely devastated by this earthquake. Over 17,000 people were killed, and approximately half a million people lost their homes. So while the city was not resilient, or because the city was not resilient, even though the Toyota plant was still standing and able to function, it couldn't actually function. So this example highlights the interconnectedness of resilience building efforts throughout a city and the importance of considering networks and how they function together. So the following slides describe the City Resilience Framework, or CRF, which is it was developed by Arup with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's a framework that we use to arrive at a common understanding of what constitutes a resilient city and how it can be achieved. The CRF has 4 dimensions, each with 3 drivers of city resilience, and together they represent the immune system of a city. To achieve resilience, all of these drivers must be present, but a weakness in one could be compensated by a strength in another. And we use them to assess to what extent a city is resilient, to identify critical weaknesses in a city, and to understand how particular projects might be able to increase a city's resilience. So the first dimension is health and well-being, and this one's about people. So it's about how everyone can meet their basic needs of food, water, and shelter, even in times of crisis, and have access to health care to prevent the spread of disease. The second one is economy and society, and this one's about organization. So creating cohesive communities that are characterized by active citizens, cultural identity, strong social networks, and it's also about the formal systems that promote law and order and sound fiscal management. The third is infrastructure and the environment, and this one is about place. So it's about cities, how cities provide, protect, and maintain and enhance both natural ecosystems and man-made infrastructure assets. It's about ensuring the continuity of critical services like water, power, solid waste management, and it's also about connecting people through transportation systems that enable the flow of goods, services, and people, and also the communication systems that ensure that people have access to information. And the last dimension is leadership and strategy. And this one is about knowledge. So it's about access to education, effective use of data, continuous learning, and sharing information through inclusive dialogues, effective leadership, and integrated and iterative planning processes, which empower stakeholders to take appropriate action. So each of these 12 drivers have sub-drivers that influence the drivers. And we can use those 7 qualities of resilient systems to consider how these sub-drivers can be influenced, which in turn influence the drivers and the dimensions. And so this framework becomes a really useful tool for talking about resilience with cities and with different stakeholders, so everyone's speaking a common language, and you can understand sort of where cities are strong, where they're weak, and what types of projects might influence resilience. So now that we've defined urban resilience, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the structure of our program and how we work with cities. So the genesis of the program was a desire to solve for 2 overarching problems that we saw in cities. The first is that cities are complex, siloed ecosystems that have many different stakeholders in many different sectors, and they're not well organized around common challenges and priorities. The second is that existing solutions in the market don't reach cities in an efficient way. And this is either because cities are unaware of solutions that exist or because they believe that only bespoke and customized solutions will work for them. So our program aims to address these 2 challenges by providing 4 types of support to cities. The first form of support is funding for the city to hire a Chief Resilience Officer, or CRO. And this is a person who leads all of the resilience building efforts in the city and coordinates the resources that we bring to the city. This person is typically a senior level advisor to the mayor. The CRO is tasked with working across silos of the government and sectors of society to ensure that the city is planning in an integrated and resilient way on a day-to-day basis. The second form of support is assistance, either through hired consultants or through our own staff, to help the CRO in developing a resilience strategy. This is a 6 to 9 month process to develop a roadmap for the city that involves engaging a broad range of stakeholders, understanding the city's strengths and weaknesses, looking at projects that the city already has ongoing, and eventually identifying the priorities that the city wants to focus on, and then putting those into an actionable set of initiatives that are written up in a resilience strategy. So the main objective of this process is to trigger action, investment, and support within the city government and from outside groups. The third form of support is access to resilience building resources from the 100 Resilient Cities City Solution Platform, which is a network of partners that offer pro bono tools and services to cities in our network. And they're supplied by a carefully selected portfolio of public, private, academic, and nonprofit sector partners. So this slide shows a number of our partners. Just to throw out a few examples of some of these partnerships. Swiss Re, the reinsurer, is offering risk assessment tools to cities in our network. Microsoft offers a cyber resilience workshop to cities in our network. And Arcadis, the Dutch consultancy, offers water management expertise. So by connecting cities and private sector solutions, we're not only helping cities address their challenge, but we're also sending a signal about existing gaps in the market and additional tools that need to be created. So in other words, by aggregating demand from cities, we're communicating to the market what tools are and are not needed, and the market can then respond to innovate and develop new tools, which can then be fed back to the network and the cities. So the last form of support that we provide to cities in our network is that we connect them all through what we call the CRO network. And so this allows them to learn from each other because we realize that many cities around the world are facing the same challenges. And so this allows them to share knowledge and not reinvent the wheel with the solutions they're developing. The selection of cities in our network was done in 3 waves so that we and the cities could all learn and innovate through the process. And so the first wave of 30 cities was selected in 2013. You can see that there's broad inclusion from all regions of the world. The second group of cities was selected in 2014, 33 additional cities. And the final wave of cities was selected just this past spring to reach 100 cities. And through our work with cities in our network over the past 3 years, we've had a unique opportunity to access global perspectives on city challenges, demands, and priorities. So before I go into the case studies, I just want to touch upon a few of the urban resilience trends that we've seen emerging from the cities in our network. The first is that cities are focused on data and using it to improve resilience. And so this is existing data that exists in cities, but it's just not formatted or structured or aggregated in a way that's useful. And then it's also new data that cities want to collect through sensors and the Internet of Things. And this information revolution isn't just about collecting and analyzing the data. It's about sharing it to empower citizens and stakeholders to inform decision-making processes that provide multiple benefits. The second trend that we're seeing is that cities not only have challenges related to existing aging infrastructure, but they also must think about the new infrastructure that's needed to keep pace with the expanding populations and economies. And so while this is a challenge, it's also a huge opportunity to incorporate resilient design into these new projects. The third trend we're seeing is increasing inequity in cities. Urban areas capture wide extremes of wealth and poverty, and sometimes they exist side by side, as this photo from Sao Paulo, Brazil shows. And through their resilience strategies, cities in our network are focused on creating more inclusive and integrated communities and addressing the needs of vulnerable populations. And finally, the fourth trend is that the majority of cities in our network are tackling water management challenges. And this is exacerbated by urbanization, population growth, and climate change. So these challenges include too much water, too little water, and access to clean water, as we also heard at lunch today. And another sort of meta trend that we're seeing is that all four of these trends are actually quite interrelated, and they're not separate or siloed problems or issues. So it's important to think about the interconnectedness of all of these issues in order to effectively address them. So I'd like to spend the last part of my presentation discussing two case studies related to climate-related initiatives in two cities in our network. The first is Da Nang, Vietnam, and the second is Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I selected these two cities to provide a global perspective for today's conversation, but we also have many cities in our network, including many in the US, like Norfolk and New Orleans, who are also highly involved in climate-related initiatives. So the first city is Da Nang, Vietnam. This is a Wave 1 city of ours, and they just actually released their resilience strategy a few weeks ago. And so between 1998 and 2015, this is a city that experienced 26 typhoons, including Typhoon Neri in 2013, as well as a number of tropical storms and floods. And it resulted in 219 deaths and destroyed over 130,000 houses in the city. The city is especially prone to rainfall flooding because it's located on a delta and it has steep hillsides that drain down into the city. And the effects of sea level rise exacerbate this rainfall flooding because it slows the drainage of this rain. And the effects of climate change are made worse by stresses from population growth in the city. In 2014, the population was around 1 million, and it's expected that by 2030, it's going to grow to about 2.5 million. So as a result, much of the investment between 2005 and 2015 was focused on addressing this urban expansion, making traffic investments and infrastructure investments, and many of these didn't consider historical flood information in the city and didn't incorporate any sort of climate adaptation measures. But now the city's starting to understand that this really has to be a focus in terms of understanding the impacts of climate change on the built environment and its populations. And, part of this heightened awareness is the acknowledgement of the connection between the city's ability to withstand these types of natural events and also its ability to grow its economy for tourism and also for new industries like high tech. So in response to this awareness of the importance of climate change, the city has embedded a number of climate-related initiatives in their strategy. I'm only going to focus on part one because that relates mainly to buildings. And so this part of the strategy, it's called a peaceful city, a city that removes fear and anxiety from places where residents live, work, and recreate. So the first action that's listed here in their strategy, it's about better understanding the exposure and vulnerability of housing in the city to the effects of climate change, including flooding and windstorms, and then also looking at the cost of damage from these events. The city worked with one of our platform partners, CSIRO, to pilot what they called a visual climate adaptation platform in 2 neighborhoods in the city. And they used historical data on storm damage to housing to understand what kind of damage they could expect from future events. And the city is hoping to continue to use this platform and develop it to visualize climate-related risks and inform citywide adaptation planning efforts. The second action listed here focuses on mitigation of climate change impacts by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The city's collaborating with another one of our platform partners, the World Resources Institute, on their Building Energy Accelerator program, the BEA program. And they're going to share best practices with the city on improving the energy efficiency of housing in Da Nang, and then help the city implement some of these solutions. And the goal of this program is to double the rate of energy efficiency in the building sector by 2030. The third action here is related to scaling up an existing program that was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation through the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, ACERN. And it's a program that focused on retrofitting housing and building new housing that was storm resistant, mainly to windstorms. The program includes a revolving loan fund combined with training on storm-resistant construction techniques. The fund's managed by the Women's Union in Da Nang, and it focuses primarily on informally constructed housing for the poorest members of the communities. And the city's in talks with the World Bank right now about scaling up this program. Related to this last action, the city also plans to more widely implement best practice that were developed for this storm-resistant housing program, and to figure out how to integrate this information into technical trainings for city staff and incorporate it into local permitting processes. And finally, the last initiative relates to developing micro-insurance products for wind-resistant housing. This also ties to the storm-resistant housing program, and it's being piloted for 500 houses. The same women's union that runs this loan program is going to purchase parametric insurance, which is basically insurance that is the payout is based on a trigger event like a certain category storm, as opposed to actually assessing the cost of damage from an event. And this allows the post-disaster funds to be paid out more quickly. So the second case study is from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I know I don't have much time left, so I'm gonna quickly go through this one. This is another Wave 1 city of ours, and they issued their resilience strategy in May. It focuses around water, infrastructure, and people. Water obviously relates to the chronic stresses from the cycles of flooding and drought in the city. Infrastructure is about dealing with maintaining and expanding the city's infrastructure, and people relates to issues of social inequity in the city. And across all three of these areas, climate change is obviously a common thread that exacerbates all three of those issues. So as a result, Goal 1 of their strategy is focused on better understanding and mitigating the effects of climate change. The first action under this goal involves collecting data on climate-related effects, including wind, heat waves, heat island effects, and establishing a means of integrating and sharing this data across city departments and other organizations. The second action is mapping of multiple hazards to understand the interaction of risks in the urban space. So they're looking at climate-related risks as well as man-made ones like epidemics. And they're going to use these multi-hazard maps as a tool to visualize the risk and identify priorities for intervention, concentrating mainly on the areas that have the highest physical and social vulnerability. The third action is to establish a panel on climate change that's similar to the one that was established in New York by Mayor Bloomberg. And the purpose of this panel is to collect and investigate and communicate all of the existing information that exists on climate change research, and to use this information to inform the city's urban planning decisions and to support public policies on mitigation and adaptation in the city. And the last action is that they want to use the findings of this panel to develop a portfolio of implementable climate mitigation and adaptation projects for the city that are ready for public, private, and international financing. And they also want to use this portfolio of projects to develop a set of standard guidelines for the mitigation and adaptation projects in the city. And lastly, I just want to mention a couple of commonalities that exist between these two case studies that are also common across the portfolio of cities in our network. The first is that cities across the globe are focused on, and they've recognized the economic importance of addressing climate change. And they understand that it's not just physical, that there are social and economic repercussions that impact the growth and welfare of cities. The second is that cities are educating themselves on their exposure and vulnerability through risk modeling and mapping. And we've learned that cities don't really know where to start. There's a wealth of information, but they don't really know where to start with all this data, and they need help doing that. And they also are recognizing the value of using mappings to communicate risk and to plan. And related to this is that they're recognizing the importance of integrated planning when it comes to addressing climate change. And the next one is cities are piloting adaptation projects to have co-benefits. These include green roofs and other types of green infrastructure, rainfall harvesting, planting new trees. These are benefits that they benefit climate change and reducing the effects of climate change, but they also provide economic, social, and environmental benefits to communities. The fifth is that cities are exploring new innovative mechanisms for financing and funding these projects to create incentives for action before a disaster occurs. And this is, the Da Nang example is one example of that. And the last point is that this is all still very new to all of these cities. And I think in most cities, it's not clear yet how this work will be integrated into the building regulatory systems. So to sort of come full circle, that's why I'm really excited about today's conversation, because I think that even though we're working with cities sort of at the forefront of addressing climate change impacts, it's not totally clear how all of this information and all of the great things that we're learning from these pilot projects will translate into changes to policy and to changes in the building regulatory systems in these countries and cities around the world. So my last slide is just a number of references that provide other case studies on climate adaptation and mitigation projects that you can feel free to explore. And my email address is here as well if you have any further questions. So thank you.
Stay here. We'll see if there's any questions. Thank you, Rebecca. That was a very nice presentation, very informational. I'd like to first go to the floor, see if there's any questions for Rebecca. Seeing none, I will ask one, maybe a couple. On your resilient officer, I was kind of curious, is that the criteria for selecting that? Is that just left up to the city? Do you guys have specific criteria you have them look at in finding one, or how does that work?
Yeah, we work with the city on a job description, and we have a number of key elements. Like, it needs to be someone who's very, as I said, a sort of a senior level advisor to a mayor. It could be someone that's already working within the city government or an outsider. It tends to be someone who's already within the city government, and they might have sort of a dual role in sustainability or some other similar related field. But we work with the city to select that person. That's one of the criteria for the grant that we give, is that we have to approve the chief resilience officer.
Okay, yes, kind of, yeah. Okay. My second question is, I know it's a very young program. Sounds like you selected the first cities in 2013, if I understood you correctly. And I know we all deal with various countries. Have you looked at and what's a perspective on potential political changes and that it could impact your program in the future? Have you guys I'm sure you must have thought about that. What are you guys doing, or what have you got in plan in place?
That's a very real issue that we're actually seeing playing out right now in a number of our cities. Rio, for example, is going through a mayoral change right now, and they issued their resilience strategy in May, but it's in some ways on hold right now because our current chief resilience officer, we know, is going to have to leave, and it's not clear who's going to take over and whether they're going to support the program. So we're kind of holding off at the moment to see where that lands. But one of the things that we're really focusing on, once cities issue a resilience strategy, we're really focusing right now on institutionalization of this program and of that position of chief resilience officer, so it's not subject to the whims of whoever the next mayor or city manager is. So it becomes a position that's permanent in the city.
Excellent. Any other, Chuck?
One quick question. Once you get on that list, let's say you make it to the 100, is there a mandate that they keep the resources committed to stay on the list? Or what is the follow-up you have once the city gets into it? What are their obligations to the program?
Resources from the city or resources from our organization to the city?
To the city, how do they maintain their status to stay within that 100 resilient communities?
Well, so the only sort of direct grant that we're providing to the city is the funding for the chief resilience officer. Aside from that, we're helping them develop this strategy, sort of consulting through that process. And then once they've issued the strategy, we're kind of a partner in working with the city to implement it, and we're not providing funds for them to implement these projects. We're providing resources through this platform partnership with all of these private partners that are providing pro bono tools and services, and we also have a number of other sort of ad hoc programs that we use to help the cities in implementation, but it's really up to the city to pursue that resilience strategy and the initiatives that they've said that are priorities for them.
It's the right step, it's the right first step.
Fred.
Is there any plan or possibility of doing a survey of building regulatory capacity across the 100 facilities?
I think that's a great idea, and I'd love to speak to you and ICC further about that. And I know we've had some preliminary discussions about collaborating on that, so I think that would be really great. I have to say, this topic is not one that gets a lot of attention, sort of codes and standards in general. I think it feels like a little obscure to a lot of the people that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, unfortunately, but it is an incredibly important topic. And so I think it's something that we need to improve and provide more resources to assist cities in supporting them with this.
Another question over here?
Yeah, we are from Nigeria, and we're part of the Nigerian delegates, and I know that Lagos is included in the list of the cities. My question is, before I go into related to Lagos, on the cities that you are working with today, which city would you consider that you have the most improved, or a more advanced effort? That is what the first part of my question is. The second part of my question is on somebody within your organization that is either assigned, the Lagos, effort, so that we can reach out to and collaborate with that individual.
Sure. So the first part, it's kind of a hard question to answer. I think, first of all, not all of the cities in our network have released a resilience strategy. For example, the third wave cities including Lagos, are still very early on in the process. Many of them, or most of them, haven't hired a chief resilience officer yet. So we're just initially working with the city to write the job description, to understand sort of where this person is going to sit in the local government. So it's really hard to assess across the entire portfolio of cities. I'd say that a number of cities in wave one of the process are doing really interesting work. I think Norfolk, Virginia is one that's doing some really interesting climate-related work. New Orleans is as well. A number of cities in Europe, a number number of cities in Oceania, and it's hard to, I can't play favorites because there are just so many doing interesting projects. And it's really, I think, just about getting through that process so they're at a point where they're ready to do that work. So it's mostly our Wave 1 cities that are starting to really get into actionable projects with our platform partners and with other resources that they're bringing to the table. And the second question, yeah, I'm happy to connect with you. Feel free to email me, and I'll put you in touch with the way we work is that we have what they're called relationship managers who manage our relationship with each of the cities. So they're the main point of contact to the city and to the chief resilience officer in that city. So I can put you in touch with our relationship manager for Lagos.
And the reason why I asked the question, so that, from a transparency perspective, is, with us, Nigeria, with the resource, handicap. So if somebody is doing well, we'll be glad to copy. We'll be glad to learn,
good.
from them, so that we can enhance, whatever little resource that we have.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we can all learn from others. But I think with that, we're, one more question? Last question. Okay.
Thank you. Just one question in terms of connecting this initiative to other initiatives that are happening. Obviously, you mentioned C40, but there are other initiatives like Sustainable Cities, other World Bank. And the question is that is there an active role to try to connect this to other initiatives? Obviously, this platform is a fantastic platform, and it can bring others to the game. At the same time, some of these cities are already doing other things that
Right.
can benefit this program, right? And if yes, it would be great to know how these connections can be made, if possible.
Mm-hmm. We definitely are conscious of that. One example is with C40. A number of cities in our network are also in C40, and so I think it's, they've told us that it's confusing because they're working on some things with C40 and some things with us, and they're all related, so we should figure out a way to collaborate. And so right now we're figuring out how we're going to form a partnership with C40 to do that, and I think that's going to continue to happen with other related initiatives.
Okay. Thank you very much for a very exciting presentation.